If you're in the market to buy a new lift kit for your four-wheel drive, you've no doubt come across all of the different questions you're going to be asked when trying to select that lift kit. And these things are such as spring rates, do you want these optional extras, do you want these optional extras, what about these optional extras? And you just have no idea what the right options and right answers are for your use case. And in today's video, we're going to be breaking down all of those common questions to help you better understand why the companies like ourselves ask those questions, and also so that way you know exactly what's best for your setup and what you're going to be getting with your lift kit. So this first question that we ask at Fulcrum Suspensions might seem like a no-brainer. However, there is an important reason we ask this question. And that is to do with what is your engine type? Is it a petrol or is it a diesel? Now, the main reason we ask that particular question is because the weight difference between a petrol and a diesel motor is significant. And a lot of different four-wheel drives come out with both a petrol and a diesel option. And that means we need to clarify before we can understand the weights that you're going to be having at the front end of your vehicle. And that's to do with the fact we don't want to be selecting the incorrect spring rate for you, which could then end up with an uneven ride, sagging on one side, sagging on the front end entirely. Maybe the springs are maybe set too harshly because we've gone the other way and now they're too firm for your ride. We don't want to have that happen, so we just need to clarify first, petrol or diesel? And that's why we ask that. Now, the next question we might ask you straight off the bat is, what is your desired lift height? Now, this is an important question because it's going to determine all of the different components that are going to be needed for your lift kit. So if you say you want a 2-inch lift kit, we need to make sure we pair up your lift kit with shocks that suit 2-inch, with springs that suit 2-inch, control arms if you go down that route with that suit 2-inch, and so on and so forth. Every single component needs to suit that lift height. If you're going a different lift height than that, you want to make sure those components then also match the different lift height. So for example, you might be going for a 3 or a 4-inch lift. And we need to make sure that we match up those components in your lift kit for those heights. The reason for this is because if you say, for example, are getting a 4-inch lift, but you only use 2-inch lift components, the shocks aren't going to be long enough. They're not going to be sitting in the correct place. And the same thing is with any sort of optional extras such as corrections for geometry. They need to suit the lift height that you're achieving in order to be able to correct that geometry in the correct way. So you can't use a 2-inch lift corrected control arm for a 4-inch lift. It's just not going to work. They need to be designed and shaped differently in order to help correct that geometry in the correct way. Now, it is important to note that while there is a lot of options out there to get 3 to 4-inch kits, you need to take into account the legality side of this. Now, in Australia, there is a lot of laws around lift heights in all states, and the police are very firm on this, and they will fine people that they find outside of those laws. So you need to make sure that if you're going for the 3 to 4-inch lift option, find an engineer, you see if it is actually possible for your vehicle, you find out what steps you need to take, because there's usually a lot of extra parts that you're going to require for those sorts of lifts, and a lot of engineering that you're going to require for those sorts of lifts. And in some cases, some vehicles just can't legally, in their state, get those lifts because the states have written in a rule that doesn't allow that vehicle or that vehicle with those specs to be able to have, let's say, a 4-inch lift, and also have bigger tires. So you need to just double check with an engineer first before purchasing anything, because you're going to run the risk of getting caught if your vehicle's not legal, and then your insurance is void. You'll get a lot of police attention and a lot of fines for being illegal, and potentially have your vehicle taken off the road for quite a long time while you fix all those issues and maybe chase down engineering or just go back down to a more legal lift kit such as a 2-inch lift. How do you go about choosing the correct front spring rate? Now, we will ask this question generally with what accessories do you run, what front loads do you have, or what spring load do you want on the front? It really does depend on what is on your vehicle and what your use case is of that vehicle. So with front spring loads, you need to pair it up to the weights that you're carrying. Because if you say, for example, are carrying 150 kilos and you use a 50 kilo load rated spring, you're not going to achieve the lift height you want. The ride is going to be terrible because the springs aren't going to be able to hold that weight. The shocks are going to be overworked and they're going to fade and also likely fail a lot quicker than if you had the correct springs. There's so many issues that can occur basically if you choose the incorrect spring rate for your vehicle while selecting your lift kit. So you need to make sure with spring rates, you're selecting correct. Front spring loads, we're going to ask the questions such as like, what weights do you carry on the front? What loads do you have? Accessories, things like that. And the reason for this is because each of those things will add up to basically the value that we need to calculate to select then the spring rate. So for example, say you have a Toyota Hilux, you've added a steel bull bar on there. Now most typical steel bull bars, if it's an aftermarket bar, will be between 50 to 100 kilos. So we're going to factor in, just to be safe, 100 kilos. If you say you have a winch, they're typically between 25 to 35 kilos. So we're going to factor that in as well. And then you might say you have spotlights, things like that, maybe scrub rails on the side of that bull bar. We need to factor in all of those weights as well. Now, those might only be small weights, but let's say you have 2 spotlights there, 2.5 kilos each, that's 5 kilos. You've got the scrub rails, they're going to be another 10 kilos of weight. So you're starting to push into that higher threshold, which is where we need to be very careful, because you don't want to select a spring that's too low, and you also don't want to select a spring that's too high, because if it's too high, you're going to run into the issue of the spring rate is going to be crazy and wanting that weight on it, and they're not going to be able to compress correctly if you don't have enough weight on them. So that means you can have a really firm ride, the front of the car will sit too high, cause a lot of other issues, your back end will be far down basically compared to the front, because the front springs are pushing the front up, which then compresses the rear. That's no good. You don't want all of that. That's going to cause a lot of headaches for you. It's also not going to be a very enjoyable ride, and we don't want that. Like, everyone wants to be able to enjoy their vehicle day to day and drive it comfortably and be able to go do those things without coming back home with a sore back because the front end of your car is just too stiff. So factor in all of those weights. It's very important. Calculate all of those weights accurately, as close as possible at least. So if you have bull bars, find the manufacturer's website of that bull bar, find the specifications on how much it weighs. If you have lights, find the weights of those. If you have an extra battery in the front, find the weight of that. You want to calculate all of those things, add them together, and then that will give us our spring rate. Now, a lot of vehicles will either have a leaf spring set up for the rear, or they'll have a coil spring set up for the rear. Some vehicles do have airbag springs in their car, but that is a pretty niche case, and a lot of cars don't really come with that, so I won't be covering that in this particular video. And likely, if you have an air spring in your car from factory, you're not generally looking to change those out unless they have failed, which then in this case, you'll be getting something like this, or you'll just be getting a replacement airbag, and you really don't need to know about spring rates if you're just getting a replacement airbag. So to start off with rear springs, there's usually 3 tiers in a lot of vehicles, and that would be light duty, medium duty, heavy duty. Now, some vehicles do have some in between those, but that's not generally all of them. A rule of thumb, we're going to be working off the idea of light, medium, and heavy duty, just for this explanation to make it easier. Let's say, for example, your car just has a few items in the back. You don't really typically load anything up. You're just driving it day to day, to and from, so let's say work or something like that. And there really isn't a lot of load in the back of there. Let's say less than 50 kilos is in the back of that car 90% of the time. In that instance, you're gonna want something that's a light duty spring. The reason for this is because you're trying to cater that spring to the 90% time. So you don't wanna get a heavy duty spring because let's say 10% of the time you're gonna be carrying a heavy load. In that instance, you go a different route entirely, which we'll get into later in this video. Yeah, if you're basically 90% of the time not loading up, get a light duty spring. It's generally up to about 50 kilos or maybe even 100, 150 kilos. That'll be a light duty spring depending on your vehicle. And that's the option I would pick if that's your use case. Now, if you're someone that has a little bit of camping gear in the back, maybe some drawers, they're relatively just packed with camping stuff, not really any heavy tooling or anything like that. Probably don't keep the fridge in the car all of the time. Even if you do, maybe the fridge is unloaded when you keep it in the car. And really you don't have too much else. Maybe you have like a roof rack and an awning. That's someone that's going to be looking at a medium duty sort of spring. That's generally a spring that's up to about 300 kilos. That's generally that sort of weight payload you'll be looking at. They might have maybe a person that sits in the back of the car every now and then, like a child, with that sort of weight, and that's completely generally okay, depending on how much weight you have in those drawers and depending how much your roof rack weighs and the awning weighs. If you're someone that's going to be carrying a lot of load in the back of that car all the time, such as you've got a full drawer system, you've got a fridge, you've got a full 12 volt, the fridge is generally full with stuff, or the drawers are full with a lot of heavy equipment. Let's say you also have a bunch of wooden cabinetry or like steel or alloy cabinetry inside there for like organization, such as pantries, things like that. You also got a rooftop tent, you've got a roof rack, you've got the awning, you have a tire carrier on the back. that's someone that's looking at a pretty much a heavy duty spring or potentially even a GVM, because by the time you get all of those things in, you're going to be pretty close to the limits of your vehicle's rear axle loads. But yeah, you're going to be looking at a heavy duty spring for that sort of weight. Like I said earlier in this section, you want to tally up basically everything you have. So it really does depend on what's in your vehicle 90% of the time. If there is an odd case where it's like 10% of the time you're going well and above, we're going to be covering an accessory that's very handy for that particular use case. So just to quickly run through the sort of weight categories of light, medium, and heavy again. Light duty will be typically 50, 100, 150 kilos. Medium duty will typically be 200 to 300 kilos, and then heavy duty will be 400 kilos plus. So most vehicles will see a 400 to 500 kilo spring available for them, particularly if they have a leaf spring sort of setup. If they're a coil spring, you may not see that option unless you're one of the bigger sort of Land Cruisers or something like that that has big rear coil springs. If you're sort of more of a MUX or something like that, you may only be able to get up to 300, 350 kilos in the rear of your vehicle. So just keep that in mind. It is also dependent on your vehicle that you've selected, how much weight you can carry, because let's just face it, some vehicles are better at carrying load than others, and that's just the reality we live in. Now, if your vehicle is a leaf spring rear vehicle, there's also options available for you for two different types of leafs. And that is regards to standard conventional leaf springs and also parabolic leaf springs like what I've got here on the table. And so the difference between these two is really a use case thing. And that is if you're having a really light duty spring, let's say 150 kilos, you go the light duty conventional leaf spring. And the reason for that is they're very small, they're very affordable as well, and generally the amount of leaves in them is very similar to a parabolic spring, and they don't really need that sort of extra load carrying capacity because you're not carrying a lot of weight. So that'll get your vehicle sitting at the correct height, it'll get your vehicle responding correctly because those springs are designed for that light duty weight. Now, if you're carrying something sort of like a middle duty or medium duty sort of weight, that's where parabolics really shine because they're lighter than your conventional leaf spring pack at that sort of weight rating, which is about 300 kilos, but these are much more comfortable, much more sort of flexible as well, so you'll get a lot more articulation out of these compared to a conventional leaf spring pack, and there's just a huge number of benefits for parabolics over a conventional spring at that sort of weight rating. Now, if you're going for something that's like 500 kilos plus, you're going to be wanting to get another conventional leaf spring pack unless there is a really good option for a heavy duty parabolic spring, which isn't the case for most vehicles. So typically in my recommendation, if you're going 500 kilos plus, get a heavy duty conventional leaf spring pack. That's going to be the absolute strongest option for you. It's also going to be very heavy though, unfortunately, because that's just how leaf springs are. Yeah, if you're carrying that sort of weight, you're going to need something strong, firm, built to stand that weight. So get that heavy duty conventional leaf spring pack and you'll have no issues carrying that weight. When you're selecting your rear springs and you are sort of confused on what options to get because you might be in that weird middle ground, please reach out to a specialist like Fulcrum Suspensions because they're going to be able to help you select the correct spring for your use case. It can be very tricky when selecting rear springs, especially if you're in that weird spot where it's between the two. So you might be in between light and medium or medium to heavy. You just really want to make sure you get this right because you don't want to be changing those out later down the track if you got it wrong because yeah, that's more money, more time, more cost. You don't want that. So please reach out if you are confused and you don't know what to get. Hopefully this section has helped you understand a little bit better on how to select your rear spring. Now, if you're one of those people that has a torsion bar front car, you don't have a front spring, so selecting a spring rate gets very difficult. In this instance, selecting a torsion bar is really a use case thing on do you have heavy loads on the front of your vehicle. If you have like a light duty load on that front of that vehicle, you likely don't need a new torsion bar, unless of course your torsion bar is seized and it needs to get basically cut out of the car in order to then put a new one in and readjust it to get the correct height. So what is the actual difference between your HD torsion bar here or a factory torsion bar? They might look very similar, however, their build is different in the sense that the metal used in the HD torsion bar is designed for heavier loads and heavier sort of impacts. And therefore it's going to handle those heavier loads a lot better than your factory torsion bar, which was designed for factory weight. When you're trying to decide on whether or not you need a HD torsion bar, you need to take into account what you're actually using or what's on the vehicle itself. So if you have a steel bull bar, maybe even a winch, I'd likely go down the route of getting a new HD torsion bar, purely for the fact that this is going to handle that weight better. It's not going to need to be wound up all of the way to be able to handle that load, because there is only so much that you can preload a torsion bar. So in order to get the correct height that you're after, such as 2-inch lift, you would want to get a HD torsion bar if you have extra load on the front of your vehicle. So short answer is, do I need to get a HD torsion bar? And the answer would be only if you have significant front end weight. And this would be things such as a steel bull bar or a steel bull bar and winch. So airbags, this is a common question we always get asked is, do I need airbags for my setup? And generally the answer is, it depends, like all things. So with airbags, it really does depend on what you're going to be using the vehicle for to determine whether or not you need airbags in your setup. And how you determine this is, let's say for example, 90% of the time you're going to have 300 kilos or less in your vehicle and you have the 300 kilo springs selected to suit that. If that 10% of the time you're going to be going up to 400, 450 kilograms, you're probably going to want to look at airbags. And that's because airbags are really, really good at handling varying loads. And what do I mean by that? Well, the airbag's job is to help assist your current springs handling the load that's heavier than what it's rated for. So if you're carrying 450 kilos on a 300 kilo spring, that spring just can't handle that load. It's going to sag down, it's going to be unsafe, it's going to affect your handling, and you're not going to have a good time in your vehicle overall. With airbags, you're able to pump those airbags up with air pressure in order to level that car back out, get the springs operating correctly, make everything handle correctly, and it's going to be a much more enjoyable time. And the way to determine if you need airbags for your setup is realistically just looking at what you're going to be using the vehicle for. And if you're someone that's going to be adding that sort of extra weight on every now and then, say every like month or 3 months or something like that, you're probably going to want to get airbags, because that's going to be the safest option for you. It's going to allow your vehicle to sit correctly when you do add that weight. You're just going to want to make sure that those springs aren't overloaded, because if you overload them, they will sag down. Over time, they will fatigue a lot quicker, and you're going to be looking at replacing those springs a lot quicker than someone that hasn't overloaded their springs. Now, a lot of people do ask the question, will the airbag make my ride stiff? And the answer is no. An airbag is basically like an air cushion. It's only as stiff as you allow the air to be. A lot of the airbags have a set PSI limit, and that's to make sure the airbag doesn't explode, basically. Generally, if you're towards that higher threshold, your springs need to be upgraded. That's just the unfortunate reality, because if you're towards the higher end of what the airbag can handle, it's too much weight for the airbag. You're carrying too much weight for those springs in general. Everything's just not going to handle correctly. It will be very, very harsh on your vehicle itself as well. That's just not the use case of airbag. But if you're someone that's only using, let's say 10, 20 PSI in that airbag, then yeah, that's perfect use case. Absolutely perfect. The airbag at 10, 20 PSI, think of a tire at 10, 20 PSI. It's not very stiff at all. It's quite plush, and you've got the weight of the vehicle on that airbag. So think about that as well. It's basically like watching your tires bellow out when you have weight on them. Same effect with these when they're running 10 to 20 PSI. Another big question we get asked all the time when people are looking at airbags and their spring rates and things like that is, why don't I just get heavier duty springs for that 10, 20% of the time instead of getting airbags? The reason why you want to try and avoid that is because heavy duty springs are much stiffer. And so if you're carrying that weight only 10, 20% of the time, the other 80% you have much less load than what the springs are rated for, you're gonna have a pretty stiff, rough ride. It's not gonna be enjoyable. It's gonna probably hurt yourself if you have, especially if you have a bad back or something like that, which let's face it, a lot of people do these days. It's just not gonna be enjoyable for all your passengers and yourself in that vehicle. And it can also damage some things because the springs just aren't compressing, so a lot of load and a lot of shock is going through all of the components in the vehicle. So to summarize this whole section, should I get airbags for my vehicle? And the answer to that is, are you someone that's going to be adding about 100 to 200 kilos over your rated spring rate every now and then? The answer is yes, you need to get a set of airbags. If you're outside of that option, you need to be looking at the spring rates themselves and not at the airbags. Now, if you have an IFS vehicle such as a Prado, a Hilux, Triton, Navara, you're going to be asked the question when selecting your lift kit, do you want upper control arms? Now, this is something that I have gone into great depth about already on YouTube, which you can check that video out. But to give you a quick rundown and a quick summary of that particular point, the simple answer is Fulcrum Suspensions highly recommends that you get an upper control arm when you do a 2, 3 or 4 inch lift on any IFS vehicle, purely for the reason that it's going to be able to give you the correct wheel alignment after the fact when you've installed that lift kit. And if you don't have the correct wheel alignment, you're going to be experiencing things such as tire wear, rubbing, scrubbing of the wheels. You're also just not going to have correct handling. The handling's going to feel incorrect. So you really do want to get that wheel alignment as spot on as possible to be able to stop any sort of extra costs or headaches. Changing the upper control arm is probably one of the easiest ways to help correct that geometry after you've changed your springs out for the lift kit, after you've changed everything out for that lift kit. And why you can't use the old one is essentially the old upper control arm is designed for factory settings, and there generally just isn't enough adjustment to be able to get a really good wheel alignment on your vehicle with the factory upper control arms using the adjustment points available on the vehicle. That's just unfortunately the hard reality of IFS vehicles. They're very sensitive to change, especially within geometry. And unless you can correct that some way, you're not going to have a really good, enjoyable experience with the driving experience of the vehicle. My answer for this whole question of whether or not you should get up control arms is I would definitely highly recommend looking at getting it. It is something that's very important. I generally would try to factor in the costs of an upper control arm, even if it's just a fixed one like this for your lift kit, to be able to stop any sort of headaches and extra costs down the line from any tire wear, or even potentially even fouling on the new lift kit from the factory arm touching the springs, because that does happen on some vehicles such as the Prado and the Hilux. Now, when it comes to diff drops, that is something that a lot of vehicles will get asked that question when they're selecting their lift kit. And the simple answer is there is no simple answer. Basically, with diff drops, what they're doing is lowering your diff a certain amount to be able to correct the CV angles. And the reason for a diff drop is to make sure those CVs aren't binding and going to bind up and lock up and snap and get damaged and things like that during full droop or full travel of that wheel. So if your vehicle with a 2-inch lift, for example, doesn't have harsh CV angles, then you won't really need a diff drop, because if there's no harsh CV angles, the benefits of a diff drop aren't really going to be super useful, because it's just going to change something that isn't already happening. So for example, if you add a diff drop to a vehicle that doesn't really need it, sure, the CV angles will get better. However, were they really at the point where it was worth getting that diff drop? Now, on the other hand, there is some vehicles out there that do need a diff drop even at 2 inches of lift, because the CV angles are starting to get pretty harsh and they look like they're going to start binding up, and that's just going to cause a lot of damage to your vehicle overall, whether it's breaking the CV itself, damaging bearings, things like that. So you just want to make sure that for your vehicle, maybe check with us, see if we're aware of any issues of that particular model having issues at 2-inch lift or 3-inch lift or things like that. That's when you would want to try and get a diff drop if we're aware of a problem. And if you're someone that's looking to get a 3-inch lift for your vehicle, we definitely recommend getting a diff drop. And that's because pretty much all IFS vehicles, once they're at that 3 inches of lift, the CV angles are just too harsh, and you do need to correct them in order to stop any sort of extra wear and tear on those CVs or potential damage to those CVs. So another sort of important item that does get overlooked sometimes is a steering dampener. So with steering dampeners, the whole entire job is to essentially absorb those vibrations and shocks through your steering that happens when you're driving on uneven surfaces. And in Australia, let's face it, every single road that we have here is an uneven surface. And then when you go on those fire trails or off-road tracks or full driving through the harsh rocky terrains or things like that, it's much, much worse. And you're gonna have a lot of shocks and vibrations through that steering that needs to be controlled and dampened. And that's where these guys come in. To answer the question of whether or not you should get one when you get a lift kit, that's really dependent on your vehicle and what you're gonna be doing. So with steering dampeners, if you're going to be upgrading your tires to a larger tire, that's going to increase the amount of shock and vibration you'll get through your vehicle. So we'd recommend upgrading that steering dampener to suit, because your factory steering dampener is only suited for the factory size tires and the amount of vibrations that that's going to be getting. That's one case scenario. Another case could be that your vehicle's just gotten to that point where everything's starting to age. So typically at about 100 to 200,000 Ks, a vehicle's shocks and steering dampeners and things like that are starting to wear out, because believe it or not, shocks are an item that does wear down. It is a wearable item. There's oil in here, and much like how you change your car's oil, the oil inside a shock needs to get changed too. Now, with a lot of shocks, they're sealed units, so that just means you need to change the shock itself. And then for some shocks, they're able to be serviced, and that means the seals and oils and stuff like that can get changed. But in this instance, a lot of steering dampeners are just complete sealed units, so you're gonna need to change those out. And that means getting a new steering dampener. So to answer the question on should I get a steering dampener or not, basically think of it like this. If you're going to be getting larger tires on your vehicle than factory, yes, I'd recommend getting an upgraded steering dampener. Or on the other side, if your vehicle has got about 100 to 200,000 Ks on it, yeah, you'd want to start looking at changing that steering dampener if it's still the factory unit. So if you have a solid axle vehicle and you're getting a lift kit, you're likely going to get asked the question, do you want to get new radius arms? So what is the radius arms job though? And like I mentioned before, its job is to correct the geometry of your front diff. And so your diff has these mounting points where the radius arm can attach to, and then this side will attach to the chassis of your vehicle. And its job is to essentially hold that angle of the diff in order to make sure there's caster in it. And you want positive caster in your axle in order to make sure that the front wheels are tracking straight, they're nice to drive with, handling wise, they're smooth, and they're not all over the shop. And that means that you can basically drive at 100 Ks an hour on the highway and not have your wheels go woo all over the place. So that's why a radius arm is important. All solid axle vehicles will have something like this in order to hold that position of the diff in order to keep it with a positive caster. When you lift a vehicle though, it does affect the position of those mounting points, which then in turn affects the position of the diff and the angle of it. So when you raise the car, this side is attached to the chassis, which is getting lifted by that lift kit, which then alters the position of these points. So you can sort of see that there. These will move, which then in turn tilts your diff. That causes your caster angle to change from being positive, which is like this, to then neutral or even negative. That's no good. That's going to give you poor handling, extra tire wear, steering's going to be all over the shop. You don't want that. Now at Fulcrum Suspensions, when we sell a solid axle lift kit, we also include caster correction bushes as part of that kit. And that's just to make sure that you have some sort of caster correction when you install that kit to stop any sort of headaches. Now, if you're someone that wants the absolute best way to correct your caster, the most possible caster out of your vehicle, then radius arms are the way to do that. The design of these radius arms, for example, much stronger than the factory arms. They're not as prone to cracking or snapping. The bushes themselves are centered and so therefore stronger and better and going to last longer. You've got all of these benefits for having a radius arm over just the caster correction bushes. But if you're someone that just needs a solution for caster correction, those bushes are already part of the kit. So aftermarket Panhard rods. A lot of people know about them and a bunch of people choose not to get them. And the reasons for not getting them, I honestly couldn't give you one. The reason why you would want to get one though is the fact that it's going to correct your wheel track and pull it back into one space. So when you lift your vehicle, your factory Panhard rod, it's a fixed position, it's a fixed sort of length. And so what happens is, because this side is attached to your diff or your axle, and then this side is attached to your chassis, when you lift it, your chassis raises up, it's then pulling this part along essentially. And that is going to cause the wheel track of your car to shift to one side. Now, that's no good. That's going to cause you handling issues. It's going to cause tire scrub potentially on one side that's getting pulled in close to the vehicle. It's then going to cause that other tire to stick out more. If you have a solid axle front that uses a Panhard rod as well, it's going to pull those out. The steering's going to be all out and cause a lot more scrub on one side than the other as well. It's just no good. Overall, you want the wheel tracks to be correct because they were designed to be correct and centered with the vehicle in the correct locations. So aftermarket Panhard rods, it's a relatively affordable optional extra in order to ensure that everything is correctly aligned in your vehicle. Now how aftermarket Panhard rods work is they're adjustable generally. So like this one, for example, is adjustable. So that means we can set the aftermarket Panhard rod to the length to correct your wheel track. Now, if it's a non-adjustable aftermarket Panhard rod, but it's suited for a particular lift, that means it's suited for that lift only, and you can't really use that or fine tune that much more than whatever it's set to when it's being made. So we generally would recommend trying to get an adjustable aftermarket Panhard rod because then you can really fine tune your wheel track. If you can't, just get an aftermarket Panhard rod that suits the lift you have. Trailing arms. So these are very similar to a Panhard rod in the sense that they're there to control the geometry of your rear axle. So with trailing arms, their jobs are to, like I said, control that position of the axle, but also change the angle of that axle. Those two things play hand in hand in the sense that the angle of the axle will change the pinion angle, which then in turn changes how the drive shaft angle comes out of that diff. You don't want that to be harsh because then you're going to start causing issues such as uni joint or U-joint wear and tear, and that's no good because those fail, they're costly to replace. You don't want that to happen. You also will get vibrations in your drive shaft, and that's no good as well. That gives you a very annoying drive, generally some noise or humming, and even some vibration through that steering wheel or even through the whole car as that drive shaft is spinning because the angle is incorrect and it's getting that little bit of force back onto it. Now, that's just pinion angles. With the regards to positioning of that axle, it's going to position where that axle is inside the guards essentially, and also the side to side positioning. So whether or not the wheels, one wheel is further forward or not compared to the other. So you want to make sure those are all correct and set correctly. That's something that a wheel aligner can do. However, they're not able to do that unless the trailing arms are adjustable. And from factory, the trailing arm lengths are suited for the factory height and factory wheels and things like that. So if you have a full factory vehicle, trailing arms from factory are completely fine. However, once you start modifying that and you add that lift kit, you change the wheels, things like that, you're going to need to adjust these things in order to correct that geometry and correct that wheel track and correct the wheel positioning and correct the pinion angle and angle of the diff. That's where these come in. Now the hard part is there is an upper trailing arm and then there's also the lower trailing arms, and there's two of each. So you've got your upper trailing arms and then you've got your lower trailing arms. Now, when it comes to these, generally in most cases, a lot of customers should be getting both. There is certain instances where you can get away with just one, and I'm going to try and cover as best as possible, if you're looking at getting just one, what each one is best suited for. So to start off with, we'll just go over why adjustable trailing arms are better, and that's purely because they're adjustable. You're able to change the position of these joints and extend the lengths in order to fine tune the position and angle of your diff. These are also upgraded in terms of like strength, and so they're going to last a lot longer than your factory ones will. The bushes have been upgraded as well to be able to handle that extra load, because your trailing arms are essentially what keeps all of that power pushing your car forward. So if these trailing arm bushes flog out, your power is not being delivered to the ground correctly, it's not pushing your car correctly, and you're just not going to have a good time. So you need to make sure that the bushes in the side of the trailing arms themselves are good condition. If they aren't, you're going to want to replace those or replace the trailing arms. It's up to you how you go about that. The trailing arms are a very important part of your vehicle because it is the part that makes the rear wheels put the power to the ground and push your car forward. So you want to make sure that the trailing arms aren't letting you down, there's no broken bushes, they're not in the correct positions and stopping you getting the maximum out of your vehicle and causing any issues down the line such as tire wear, incorrect position of the axles, vibrations. So many issues can come around just because the trailing arms aren't correct for your lift kit. So when you get the best of both worlds, so if you buy both the upper and the lower trailing arms, you're going to be able to correct your pinion angles and also axle position. The pinion angle, like I said before, is the angle of your diff and how the drive shaft comes out of it and connects to your gearbox and transfer case and things like that. That is important because if that is incorrect, you're going to add extra wear and tear on a lot of components in that drive shaft and along that line, including the gearbox, in your diff, the U-joints, things like that. You're going to cause vibrations if that's incorrect. That's not enjoyable and just completely ruins the driving experience of your vehicle and is very frustrating to deal with. The other factor obviously is the position of your diff now. So the position is important for keeping that wheel in the correct spot within your wheel, like within your guards, and allowing those tires not to be scrubbing on something, allows the full range of articulation as well, because these will move and articulate with your axle as you're going off-road. If these aren't correct, that could be holding your axle up and stopping any extra articulation you'd expect from your lift kit, stopping you from maximizing the potential that you could be getting out of your vehicle. So these are pretty important components. Now, if you're someone that's going to be going down the route of only getting one of the trailing arms and not upper and lowers, you're just going to get lowers or you're just going to get uppers, you can adjust your pinion angle or your axle positioning, but only to a certain extent. And that is because the other trailing arms that you didn't get are still fixed, meaning that their positioning is staying there. So if you are someone that's, let's say for example, got the lower trailing arms and your upper trailing arms, still factory ones, they're fixed in place, they're holding that position and that mount. When you adjust that lower trailing arm, yeah, you can adjust that pinion angle. However, if you pull it in, it's going to pull that wheel in towards the front. If you extend it out, it's going to pull that wheel out. Whereas if you get both, you're able to then adjust both of the lengths to be able to be at that axle positioning correct. And then also you can adjust the angles at the same time. So like you basically got this movement and also this movement from both positions if you get both arms. And that's very important. Now, to help someone though that is just getting that one arm, I'm going to let you know which set you should be getting depending on the issues that you're facing. So if you're someone that's trying to just correct mainly axle positioning and not so much the pinion angles, because let's say you've done your lift, the pinion angles look okay, and you just really need to change that position of that axle, the lower control arms are best suited for that, and they will help correct that axle positioning. It will slightly compromise your pinion angles though, so if you're just on that cusp, it could make your pinion angles worse and therefore start causing those issues. But it's something to keep in mind. And this is typical for those sort of smaller lifts. So your 1 to 2 inch lifts would generally just need some sort of axle position correction. Whereas if you're trying to go for pinion angle correction, because your pinion angles are all out and you're getting vibrations and stuff like that, you're going to want to get upper trailing arms. And that's just purely because the upper trailing arms will help correct that angle a lot better than the lower ones will. And the position of that axle isn't going to be as much affected by the upper trailing arms, purely just because of how they're positioned and the geometry that they affect. So to sum this all up, what we would recommend is to get both upper and lowers to be able to correct your axle position and pinion angles and be able to get a really good alignment of that rear axle. However, if you're unable to do that and you're looking to just try and fix small issues such as like the axle position or the pinion angle, not both, then pinion angle, I would go with the upper trailing arms, and then axle position, go with the lower trailing arms. Choosing your lift kit components doesn't need to be overwhelming. And at Fulcrum Suspensions, we're here to help you try and pick the best parts for your 4x4 and for your needs. And that's why if you still have questions after this video, please feel free to reach out to us either through the website or giving us a call and talking to one of our experts, and we'll be able to help you out in deciding on what sort of components you'll need for your 4x4 and your needs. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you guys. If you have any questions regarding anything in this video, please feel free to leave them down below. And if there's anything that I didn't cover in this video that you want an answer for, please leave them down below as well, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. So thanks for watching, guys. Please hit the subscribe and like button if this video was helpful for you today, and I hope to see you guys out there on the tracks.